The desert sun had a way of stealing a person's breath. It beat down from a sky so wide and clear that it seemed like there was nothing else in the world but heat, dust, and the red cliffs that rose like walls of an endless fortress. The river that wound its way through those canyon walls was the only relief, a silver ribbon against the scorched earth. For travelers and settlers alike, that river meant life. But for one frightened young woman clutching her arms around herself in the cool stream, it meant something else entirely: danger, shame, and a desperate plea that might change her life forever. She hadn't meant to wander so far from camp. The settlers had stopped near the river that morning, their wagons drawn in tight, wheels creaking, oxen groaning in the sun. The men argued over maps while the women fetched water and tried to scrub dust from clothes already stained with travel. She had wanted only a few moments to herself, a breath of quiet away from the bickering and the harsh eyes of those who thought she wasn't strong enough for this journey west. So she had slipped away, wading into the river where the canyon bent. Laughing softly at the feel of the current tugging at her dress. It had seemed safe then, hidden by reeds and stone, a place where the world could not reach her. But safety was an illusion on the frontier. It never lasted long. The voices came first, coarse laughter breaking across the stillness of the canyon. Strangers, not settlers, not anyone she knew. By the time she turned her head, it was too late. Men with hard eyes and cruel mouths stood at the bank, their boots stirring dust, their rifles glinting in the sun. They mocked her, pointing, daring her to move. And before she could run, before she could even think, they were gone again, leaving nothing behind but their laughter carried on the wind and the terrible realization that they had stolen her clothes. Every stitch, every piece she had left on the rocks, vanished. She was trapped in the water. Trembling in shock, the vast wilderness pressing in on her, the river that had been her refuge now felt like a prison. Her heart thundered in her chest, not just from shame but from the thought of what might happen if those men returned. She was alone, vulnerable, and the wagon camp was too far away. The settlers would never believe her story, and even if they did, the shame of walking back through camp half hidden by nothing but her hair and the muddy water would ruin her. She sank deeper, clutching her arms across her chest, whispering prayers to a sky that had never once answered her. Then the sound of footsteps came from the rocks behind her. Slow, steady, sure. Not the mocking shuffle of cowards. Something else. She turned, fear biting into her throat, ready to beg or scream. But it was not one of the cruel strangers who stepped into view. It was a figure both strange and striking, standing tall against the canyon's red glow. His hair was long and dark, braided neatly down his back. His chest was bare, the sun painting it in bronze, and in his hand he carried a folded buckskin coat. His eyes, dark and steady, locked onto hers, not with the hunger she had seen in the others, but with something calmer. Deeper, watchfulness, strength, danger, perhaps. But not the kind that mocked or toyed an Apache. She had heard whispers of them all along the trail. To settlers, the word carried fear, stories told around the campfire of raids, ambushes, and battles with soldiers who never seemed to win. The Apache were warriors, proud and fierce, the land itself their ally. Children in the wagon train clung to their mothers when the word was spoken, as though shadows might spring from the sagebrush to claim them. Yet here he stood, not as a shadow but as flesh and blood, as solid as the cliffs themselves. And he was watching her with eyes that missed nothing. Her lips parted, trembling, and the words spilled out before she could stop them. Please, please help me. They stole my clothes. The confession felt raw in her throat, a mix of shame and hope, the most vulnerable plea she had ever spoken. She wanted to vanish into the river, yet she could not hide from him. He was already there, seeing her as no one else ever had. For a long moment, he did not move. The wind carried only the cry of a hawk circling far above, the rush of the river, the pounding of her heart. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, holding out the buckskin coat. It was worn but strong, smelling faintly of smoke and leather, a warrior's garment meant for battle and travel. It was not meant for her. And yet in that moment, it was the only shield she had left in the world. She reached for it, her hands shaking, but her eyes never left his. He said nothing, but there was weight in his silence, as though he was measuring her, deciding whether she was worth the trouble, whether her desperate plea would bind him to her fate. She wanted to ask why he had appeared, why he had not turned away when he found her stranded and helpless. But the questions caught in her throat unsaid. Lost in the rush of fear and gratitude, the canyon seemed to close in around them, the walls holding their secret. Somewhere in the distance, a gunshot cracked like thunder, carried on the wind. She flinched, clutching the coat tighter, and his gaze shifted sharply toward the sound. The world outside the river had not forgotten her. Danger still hunted these lands, and she was no longer sure if the Apache before her was her salvation or another kind of peril altogether. The settlers would never trust him. And yet, standing there in the water with her heart hammering, she knew that he might be the only one who could lead her out of this canyon alive. She needed him, even if she didn't understand him, even if everything she had ever been told warned her against it. He was wild, untamed, a man bound to the desert in ways she could never be. And yet, in the shadow of those red cliffs, she felt something stir inside her that she could not name. Her voice cracked, soft and desperate. "Don't leave me here." She did not know if he would understand her words. But her eyes pleaded the truth, her mouth could not speak. The river flowed on, endless and merciless, and the wind carried more distant echoes of riders, laughter, and gunfire. She clutched the coat, shivering despite the sun. Waiting for his answer, he turned his gaze back to her, unreadable. And for a breathless moment, she thought he might walk away, leaving her stranded in shame and fear. But his hand shifted, tightening on the strap of his weapon. His jaw set. His eyes burned with quiet resolve. Whatever he chose in that moment would change everything. The canyon, the river, the endless road west, all of it, hung in silence between them, balanced on the edge of his decision. And then, without a word, he stepped closer. The Apache warrior stepped closer, his shadow falling across the water where she stood trembling. He did not speak, but his silence carried the weight of something more powerful than words. Slowly, he draped the buckskin coat across her shoulders, the heavy leather sinking against her wet skin. She clutched it tight, breathing in the faint scent of smoke and dust, the smell of campfires and long journeys under open skies. It was rough against her, far different from the cotton dresses she had worn since childhood, but it was warm, and it was safety. For the first time since the strangers had stolen her clothes, she felt shielded from the cruel world. Yet the man before her was still a mystery, one she could not begin to understand. He watched her carefully, his eyes steady and dark, as though studying the way she moved, the way she trembled, the way she fought to hold her fear in place. She realized then that he had probably seen fear 100 times before, perhaps 1,000, in the eyes of enemies and travelers alike. Yet he did not mock her. He did not laugh or jeer as the men had. There was something steady in him, something that told her he was not moved by cruelty. That thought gave her a fragile thread of hope, though she knew well that hope was dangerous in a land like this. The canyon around them seemed to stretch endlessly, the red cliffs towering like silent judges. The river whispered against the rocks, as if reminding her that life flowed on, whether or not she was ready to face it. Far in the distance, another crack of gunfire echoed faintly. Her eyes darted toward the sound, her heart pounding all over again. She whispered in a trembling voice, "They're still out there." She was not sure if he understood her words, but the way his jaw tightened and his hand brushed the handle of his weapon told her he did not need language to grasp her meaning. Danger was close. Too close. He stepped back, motioning with his hand toward the riverbank. At first, she hesitated. Her feet were heavy with dread, her mind screaming that to leave the water meant exposing herself to the harshness of the desert once more. But the way he stood firm, unwavering, pulled her forward. She climbed carefully, the coat hanging low to cover her as best it could. And when she reached the rocks, she found herself only a few steps away from him. His presence was overwhelming, not cruel but commanding, the kind of presence that filled every space around it. She did not know whether to fear him or trust him, perhaps both. She followed him as he turned away from the river, his stride sure, his bare feet silent on the earth. He moved as though the land itself belonged to him, as though every stone and shadow answered to his will. She tried to keep up, stumbling over sharp rocks, clutching the coat tighter to her body. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the cry of distant birds and the crunch of gravel beneath her feet. She wanted to ask him questions, to demand who he was, why he had appeared, why he had not left her to her shame. But her voice would not rise. The desert had a way of swallowing words. His silence made her own feel heavy. They climbed higher along the canyon wall, till they reached a ledge overlooking the river. From here, she could see far across the land. The wagon trail stretched like a faint scar in the distance. Tiny dots moved slowly along at her people, the settlers, pressing onward west without knowing what had happened to her. A lump formed in her throat. If they thought she had wandered off, they would not search for long. In this country, the lost were rarely found. She felt the sting of tears, but she forced them back. Unwilling to let her fear show any more than it already had, the Apache man crouched near the edge of the ledge, his eyes scanning the horizon with the patience of a hunter. She knelt beside him, clutching the coat tighter, and dared to whisper, "Do you think they'll come back?" Her words floated on the wind, small and uncertain. He did not answer right away. His gaze lingered on the far-off canyon mouth, the place where shadows moved in ways that did not belong to the natural world. Then he gave the smallest nod, his expression hardening. Yes, they would come back. Her stomach twisted into knots. For a long while he stayed there, motionless, his body as still as the stones around him. She realized he was listening, not only with his ears, but with every part of him. His breathing was even, his eyes sharp, as though the land whispered secrets directly to him. She wondered what it would be like to move through the desert that way, to be bound to it instead of lost within it. She wondered, too, if that bond made him less a man and more a part of the wilderness itself. The settlers would call him savage, but as she watched him, she knew there was nothing savage about him. He was the land untamed, dangerous, beautiful in its own fierce way. When he finally rose, she rose too, though her legs trembled beneath her. He motioned once more, urging her to follow, and together they climbed higher into the canyon. The path twisted sharply, hidden from below, and soon the river was no more than a glimmer far beneath them. She felt her breath grow short, the climb straining her body. But he moved without hesitation, pausing only once to glance back and be sure she had not fallen behind. That single glance struck her deeply, was not kindness exactly, but it was not indifference either. It was acknowledgement, as though for reasons she did not yet understand. He had chosen not to abandon her. They came at last to a small hollow tucked between two great slabs of rock. The ground here was soft with sand, shaded from the worst of the sun. It felt hidden, protected, a place where the outside world could not easily intrude. He motioned for her to sit, and she obeyed, the coat still wrapped tight around her. He crouched near the entrance, watching the canyon with unblinking eyes. The silence pressed down on them, heavy and unspoken. She dared finally to break it, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why did you help me?" The question hung in the air. His head turned slightly, his gaze falling on her, and for a long moment he simply studied her face. She thought perhaps he would never answer, but then he spoke, his voice low, steady, edged with an accent that made his words feel older than the cliffs around them. "Because you asked?" That was all. Because she had asked. She stared at him, her heart pounding, and realized she had no answer to that. The sun began to sink lower, casting long shadows across the canyon. The cries of distant birds gave way to the eerie stillness of twilight. She could not help but feel exposed, even in their hidden hollow. Somewhere out there, the men who had laughed at her were still moving. Perhaps they hunted her now. Perhaps they thought her an easy prize. The thought made her shiver. She drew the coat closer and, without thinking, whispered, "I'm afraid." The words slipped out before she could stop them. His eyes flickered toward her again, and though his expression did not soften, there was something in it that told her he understood. The darkness grew deeper, and with it came the sounds of the desert night howls in the distance, the rustle of unseen creatures. She hugged her knees to her chest, fighting against the rising tide of fear. The Apache warrior remained at the hollow's edge, silent, unmoving, as though nothing in the night could shake him. She envied that strength. She wondered if she would ever find such courage in herself. She wondered if she could survive even a single night in this wild, merciless land without him. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke. He stiffened, his hand moving to his weapon. She caught the scent too, her heart leaping into her throat. Somewhere close, a fire burned where there should be none. She looked at him, her voice trembling. "They're near, aren't they?" He gave a single nod, his eyes narrowing into the darkness. Her pulse raced. The canyon walls seemed to close in. The night alive with unseen threats. She wanted to speak again, to ask what they would do, where they would go, but before she could, he lifted his hand in silence, warning her to hold her tongue. She froze, every muscle taut, her breath caught in her chest. The night pressed in around them, and in that silence, she understood the truth. Whatever came next would decide her fate, and perhaps his as well. The danger was no longer distant. It was here, in the shadows, creeping closer with every passing heartbeat. Night held the canyon like a clenched fist. Wind tugged at the brush, sending dry whispers along the rocks. The Apache warrior listened without moving, one hand near his weapon, the other resting lightly on the stone, as if the land itself were a companion he trusted. She kept still, counting her breaths, willing her fear to quiet. The faint smell of smoke drifted again. It was stronger now. Somewhere close, men were camped where they had no right to be. She pictured them, the same rough faces that had laughed when they took her clothes at the river. The same easy cruelty in their eyes. Outlaws, drifters, who hunted the weak along the frontier trail. He shifted and motioned for her to stay low. Then he slipped out of the hollow and into the shadows. She hesitated, only a heartbeat before following. The coat brushed her legs, heavy and warm, the only thing between her and the night air. They moved across the ledge in silence. He led her along a narrow path she never would have seen alone. Far below, the river shone like a black ribbon. Owls floated between the cliffs, pale wings soundless. The Wild West was never truly silent, she realized. It only traded one set of sounds for another. Day gave the whip of wind and cries of hawks. Night gave the breath of hidden things, the crackle of distant fire, the soft pad of predators on the hunt. They reached a split in the rock, and he crouched again. From there, a thin view opened toward the canyon mouth where the smell of smoke was thickest. She pressed close beside him and peered into the dark. Tiny orange dots flickered. A fire figures moved around it. She could not see faces, only shapes, but she knew in her bones that the men from the river were there. The warrior's breath was steady. He watched for a long time, counting, measuring. She tried to mimic his patience, but her nerves sparked with every shadow. At last he leaned close and spoke low, so the sound would not carry. For men, maybe 5. Horses. They wait for morning. His voice was controlled. She heard something beneath it, a strain like a tightened bowstring. She nodded, as if she understood the plan he had not yet shared. He studied the scene longer, then pointed toward a sloping chute of scree that led down toward scrub and a cluster of rocks shaped like crouching animals. "There," he murmured. "Water pocket, shelter. You stay." "I don't want to be left," she whispered. The confession surprised her. Fear, yes, but also a pull she could not name. He had given her back more than a coat. He had given her a way to keep standing. The thought of him leaving, even for a short while, felt like the wind had shifted against her. He was quiet a moment. Then he nodded once, as if adjusting a plan in his head. "We go together," he said. Slow, quiet. They picked their way down the slope, stones sliding under their feet. Twice she stumbled and he steadied her. A brief touch, firm and careful. At the bottom, they crouched behind the crouching rocks. He pointed to a crack where rain had carved a narrow basin into the stone. It held a finger of water, still and cold. She sipped, grateful for the simple, clean taste. He drank, and then dipped 2 fingers in the basin, pressing wetness to the rock in a pattern that meant nothing to her. A sign, she guessed, for others who might pass through this place. The land, the people who knew it, the codes they kept. She was standing inside another world. A faint clink carried from the outlaw camp. Laughter answered it. Her shoulders tightened. The warrior's eyes sharpened. He angled his head, listening again. "They drink," he said. "They feel safe." The way he said it made clear how foolish safety can be in the desert. She found her voice. "They took my clothes to shame me. But they wanted more. Why else wait?" "For you," he said. "And for what you know." When she frowned, he added, "Wagon trail. Where they go, what they carry." Her stomach turned. The settlers drove west with mirrors and kettles, quilts and seeds, simple tools, simple faith. They also carried a small iron box locked tight in the lead wagon. She had seen it once when a trader joined them for 2 days, then moved on. He had knelt near the fire with the men and whispered about a silver strike north of the river and maps worth more than any single wagon. The iron box had been kept out of sight after that. She realized now how the trader had watched, how he had smiled without warmth. She told the warrior what she knew. His jaw hardened, not in anger at her people, but in recognition of the way greed moved like a sickness through these canyons. "Maps bring soldiers," he said. "Soldiers bring war. You want peace," she said softly. "A quiet life." "Life with room to breathe," he answered. The wind shifted again and brought a new scent. Horses, lather, and dust. He rose halfway and studied the skyline above the outlaw camp. She saw it too then, the faintest movement against the ridge. Not outlaws this time. The shape was wrong. A rider crouched low, then another, a small party moving without fire. Not soldiers, she thought. Scouts? Maybe men from the nearby reservation, or from an Apache camp the settlers never saw. Allies of the warrior, or rivals. Her pulse raced. "Yours?" she asked. He shook his head. "Different people." He did not lower his voice. There was caution in it now. "Yavapai, maybe, or mixed." Hard to tell in night, his mouth set with a quiet resolve. "They do not help us." She suddenly felt the fragile nature of the ground under her feet. 5 outlaws at the fire, unknown riders above, a wagon train full of families tugging west, and her wrapped in a coat that did not belong to her. Standing beside a man who had saved her for no reason other than that she had asked. The desert tightened around them like a snare. A coyote yipped. The unknown riders stilled, then sank lower. The outlaws laughed again. She caught the words now, broken by distance. They joked about the settlers, about the women in bonnets, about the iron box one of them claimed would fetch a price for men in a border town. They were waiting for dawn to strike. The plan sank into her like a cold stone. The warrior leaned close. "We move before first light," he said. "We make them look wrong way. I bring them to chase me." "No," she said too quickly. "They will kill you. They try," he said. The words were simple, not boastful. It was a fact he had lived with his whole life. She swallowed hard. She wanted to argue but could not shape the words. He placed a hand on the rock, palm flat, and in the dim light she saw scars crossing the knuckles. Each was a story she did not know. The hours stretched. They traded few words. She learned more from the quiet than she expected. He checked the wind often. He tested the ground for vibration. Twice he touched his throat, a signal to still even breathing. She followed as best she could. Fear narrowed her thoughts, but a strand of stubbornness held. She had been raised to be decent and polite, to hold her place, to trust the rules of towns and churches. But the rules had failed her at the river. The outlaws had known it. This man had not. That realization changed something inside her, just before the sky began to pale. The warrior squeezed her arm and pointed toward a cleft in the stone-down canyon. "Hide there." If I do not return by midday, follow the river to the second bend. Find a mesquite, scarred by lightning. Wait, I will find you. What if the outlaws find me first? She asked. Do not let them, he said. Then his gaze softened by a fraction. You are not made of glass. She wanted to tell him she knew that now, because of him. The words stuck. He slipped away and became part of the stone. She watched him low crawl along a shadow line until even her straining eyes lost him. She crept to the cleft and folded herself behind a rib of rock. She could see the outlaw camp through a narrow slit. The men had dozed. One poked the fire with a boot, then lit a cigar and walked a lazy circle. He tossed something into the flames. It sparked bright for a moment, then died. The unknown riders on the ridge still waited. The canyon held its breath. A whistle rose from the river. It started like a bird call, then twisted into something human. One of the outlaws jerked his head up. Another cursed and grabbed his rifle. The whistle came again from a third direction. The men scattered, peering into the dark. Somewhere a small stone skipped, then another. It was a game the warrior was playing with the land. The outlaws spun, trying to catch a target that would not stand still. She saw him then, only for a heartbeat. A figure flickered at the edge of a thorn bush and vanished again. A flash of movement at the riverbank. He was drawing them away one by one, baiting them into the maze of brush and stone, where sound bounced and light lied. The unknown riders stayed put. They were listening to, waiting to see who held the advantage. The man with the cigar stepped farther from the fire, swearing as he went. He pointed toward the river, and the others followed. The camp emptied, except for one who stayed to hold the horses. He paced and spit and kicked at a saddlebag. She watched him, her hands tight on the coat. If she were braver, she thought wildly, she could slip down and cut the horses loose. But bravery was not foolishness. She stayed hidden and waited, as he had told her. A gunshot cracked, then another, farther off. No cries followed. The man with the horses froze, eyes wide. More shots, scattered, ricocheting. The sound made her flinch, though she knew the warrior had planned for it. Smoke drifted. The horses stamped and pulled at their reins. The guard cursed and tried to calm them. He had turned his back to the rocks. She stared at the knife glinting at his belt, and then at the rope anchoring 3 mounts to a pin wedged. Into the earth she moved before she could think better of it. She slid from the cleft and kept to shadows. Each step sent heat up her spine. She reached the cluster of low brush behind the horses. They smelled of sweat and fear. Her hands shook. She pulled at the pin. It stuck. She worked it back and forth, praying the guard would not turn. A pebble skittered under her foot. The guard half turned, scowled at the horses, then faced the river again. She yanked. The pin gave an inch. Another shot splintered stone. The horses reared. The rope tightened, jerking the pin half free. She used the surge to rip it out. The horses lurched forward as one. The guard shouted and grabbed for a rein, but the nearest animal bolted and dragged him several steps before he fell. He rolled, spitting curses. She scrambled backward, the freed rope snaking past her legs. The horses tore toward the brush, and then up a side wash, thundering into the dim light. The guard chased, and then gave up, panting. He looked at the empty ground where the pin had been. Then, at the narrowing wash, and roared a threat into the air. The outlaws would know now that their tidy plan was broken. She slipped back to her cleft and pressed her cheek to the cool stone. Her heart drummed so hard it hurt. She had done something real with her own hands. She did not feel like the same person who had stood shivering in the river. The ridge riders began to move. They drifted along the skyline, keeping their distance. The outlaws were split and confused, 3 shapes chasing a ghost toward the river. One shouting after the horses, another circling back toward camp. The warrior had stirred a nest he could not hold forever. She scanned for him, hoping for a sign. Nothing. The sky brightened. Color returned to the cliffs. The outlaw who circled back reloaded his rifle and bent near the fire. He kicked dirt over the coals and scanned the ground. He could follow tracks now. She tasted the grit of fear again. Tracks would show where the warrior had crawled and where she had crept. Her courage felt thin as paper. A shout rose from the river. It carried terror, then silence. She clutched the coat so hard her fingers ached. A raven dropped from the ridge and cut across the camp. The outlaw by the fire looked up and looked where the bird went as if it were an omen. He spat and started toward the cleft, straight toward her. Her mind raced. If he reached the crack, he would see her. She slid backward, deeper into the cleft, and felt a second passage slope behind her. She wriggled into it on her elbows. The stone scraped her arms. The coat snagged. She pulled and kept pulling until the rock narrowed around her ribs. She felt trapped. She kept moving because the only other choice was to freeze. The passage bent. Cool air touched her face. Another slit opened to the canyon. Through it, she saw a different angle of the camp and the river's bend. She peered out. The outlaw had stopped a dozen strides short of her hiding place. He crouched, studying marks on the ground. He reached to touch a faint print beside a thorn bush. It could have been hers. He frowned, then stood and faced the river again. A shape rose behind him, silent as the shadow of a cloud. The Apache warrior. He moved with a speed that seemed to pull the space out from around him. In one clean motion, he swept the outlaw's legs and drove him to the ground, pinning his wrist before the rifle could rise. The man bucked and spat and lunged for a hidden blade. The warrior twisted, and the blade clattered away. He pressed his forearm to the outlaw's throat, not enough to kill, enough to still. She wanted to cry out a warning, but another shape burst from the brush and slammed into the warrior's side. A third followed. The outlaws had looped back faster than she and the warrior had guessed. He rolled, sending one man into the coals, but the second swung the rifle stock and caught his shoulder. The crack made her flinch. She pressed her fist to her mouth to hold in a sound that could give her away. Dust flew, boots thudded. The fight was brutal and up close, without time for careful plans. He rose again, staggering, and struck the man with the rifle so hard the stock broke. The third outlaw lunged with a knife. The warrior stepped inside the arc and drove his knee up. The knife fell. For an instant he held the advantage. Then a shot split the air from the riverbank, and rock splinters rained over the camp. The unknown riders had chosen a side or only a target. She could not tell. The warrior dove as another shot cracked. He rolled toward the brush, grabbed the broken stock, and hurled it at the shooter. It smacked stone. The shooter shifted and fired again. The bullet screamed past the warrior and buried in sand a stride from her hiding place. The sound jolted her as if struck. He glanced toward the cleft in that moment, eyes searching, and she knew he was counting where she might be. Another shout carried down from the ridge. The outlaws scattered for cover. The warrior slipped behind the thorn bush and vanished like smoke. She lay with her cheek to the cool rock and tried to breathe without noise. The canyon had turned into a game board with too many hands on the pieces. Wagons north. Outlaws near the river. Ridge riders choosing when to strike. And the one person who had stood between her and ruin now hunted from both sides. The sun lifted a finger over the rim, gilding the camp in hard light. The fight paused only by inches, each side waiting for the other to blink. She knew the stillness would break. She knew another shot would come. She knew, too, that the iron box in the wagon train would draw everyone like water draws the thirsty. The day was only beginning, and the worst of it had not yet arrived. She pressed the coat's collar to her mouth to muffle her, breathing, and fixed her eyes on the place where the warrior had disappeared. The choice that had seemed simple at the river asked for help, except it had pulled her into a world of complex lines. Every step forward now would write a new part of the story, and somewhere in the maze of stone and heat and dust, a decision waited that neither of them could avoid. The canyon was awake now, not with peace, but with the kind of stillness that carries the weight of waiting violence. The first sunlight poured across the red cliffs, sharpening every edge of stone until they looked like blades. Smoke from the outlaw fire clung to the air. drifting in thin gray ribbons that seemed to mark the camp as a place already claimed by danger. She crouched low behind the slit of rock, her pulse thudding against her ribs, every breath sharp and uneven. She could see men shifting in the camp, their faces clearer now in the daylight. Hard mouths, rough beards, eyes that glinted with greed. They were restless, snapping at one another, scanning the horizon. The calm of the night had vanished. The warrior was still hidden somewhere near the thorn bush, but she could no longer see him. That absence clawed at her nerves. She searched for him in every shadow, listening for the faintest sound that might tell her he was still alive and still fighting. Instead, she heard only the voices of the outlaws. One cursed the rider who had fired from the ridge. Another muttered about the horses she had loosed. They were angry, restless, and more dangerous now than before. It was clear to her they would not wait much longer to strike the wagon train. They wanted the iron box. They wanted blood. And they wanted her too, though they did not know she was close enough to hear every foul word. Then came the riders on the ridge. Their silhouettes cut sharper in the morning light. 3, maybe 4, though the heat haze made them blur into one another. They didn't move to leave. They didn't move to join the fight either. They lingered, watching, waiting like hawks circling a wounded rabbit. The outlaws noticed them too, pointing, spitting, swearing that the canyon was crawling with spies. One lifted his rifle and fired a shot high into the air, more warning than aim. The riders did not flinch. Their presence pressed heavier by the minute, a silent threat hanging above. Her mind raced. The wagon train was moving west even now, wheels creaking, families huddled together. They had no idea men waited in the canyon with rifles and hunger in their eyes. They had no idea their maps and supplies had already been marked for theft. She wanted to run, to find them, to shout a warning. But she could not leave. Not when the warrior was still somewhere in the brush, alone against men who outnumbered him. Not when every shadow hid another gun. A sudden rustle snapped her back. One of the outlaws had broken from the group and was pacing toward her side of the rocks. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his shirt torn, a scar cutting across his cheek. He carried a pistol loose in his hand, swinging it carelessly as he searched the ground. She shrank back into the cleft, pressing her body against the cold stone. The coat pulled tight around her. Her breath sounded too loud, her heart beat like a drum. If he stepped only a few more strides, he would see her. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. But before he reached the cleft, sound split the canyon, the sharp whistle she had heard before. It echoed, bouncing off the cliffs, turning one direction into 3. The outlaw jerked his head toward the river, eyes narrowing. Another whistle answered, this one from higher ground. The scarred man cursed and raised his pistol. He backed away from her hiding place, turning instead toward the sound. Her lungs loosened with relief, though it was thin and fleeting. The warrior was drawing them again, pulling their eyes, their ears, their rage. But how long could one man stretch a fight this way? How long before a bullet found him? Gunfire cracked again, this time closer, sharper, the kind that meant not just warning but intent. The outlaw camp erupted in shouts. Men scrambled, rifles lifted, boots pounding across the sand. The ridge riders began to move too, their horses shifting against the skyline. The canyon was on the edge of breaking open, and she knew once it did, there would be no going back. She crouched lower, trying to think, trying to push back the fear long enough to see what could be done. She had no weapon, no strength to match armed men, but she had already loosened the horses once. She had already seen how chaos could be turned into cover. If she could find some small way to help again, maybe the warrior would not have to stand against it all alone. Her fingers dug into the sand. She forced her breath to slow. Her fear was still there, but beneath it now was something sharper, something that felt dangerously close to courage. The next moment shattered the stillness. One of the outlaws fired across the canyon, aiming at the ridge. The crack echoed so hard the cliff seemed to ring. A rider answered with a shot of his own, and a horse screamed as the bullet found flesh. Dust rose, men cursed, and the ridge riders began to descend. The outlaw camp scrambled like ants under spilled water. In the chaos, she finally saw him again. The warrior. He broke from the brush, low and fast, striking at the outlaw with the scarred cheek. The man went down hard, his pistol clattering across the ground. The warrior didn't pause. He drove forward, silent as a shadow, moving toward the fire where another rifleman knelt. Her chest tightened at the sight of him, so close, so fearless against men who wanted nothing more than his death. She wanted to cry out, to warn him of the outlaw rising behind, but her voice stuck. Instead, she pressed her fist against her mouth and watched, helpless. The fight was everywhere now, shouts, gunshots, horses bucking in terror, smoke curling upward. The Ridge Riders swept down like wolves, firing into the camp. The outlaws returned fire, their bullets snapping against stone. The canyon had become a battlefield, the iron box, the wagon train, even her own safety forgotten in the frenzy. All that mattered now was survival. The warrior fought with the land at his back, each move controlled, deliberate. But even he could not be everywhere at once. Two men cornered him near the fire, their rifles raised. She gasped, her hands clenching around the stone. He ducked one shot, but the second outlaw closed in. Her whole body screamed at her to move, to do something, anything, but she was rooted in place by fear. Then her eyes caught the fallen pistol lying half buried in the sand. The scarred man had dropped it when the warrior struck him down. It was only a few steps away from where she hid. Her stomach turned to ice. If she reached for it, she would expose herself. They would see her. Yet if she didn't, the warrior might fall, and with him, every fragile chance she had left. She pressed her back against the stone, fighting the storm in her chest. The sounds of the canyon pounded in her ears, gunfire, shouting, the shriek of a hawk overhead. Her choice was no longer something she could push aside. The moment demanded it. She shifted, inch by inch, her eyes fixed on the pistol. The sand was cool under her fingers as she crawled forward, her knees scraping against the stone. The outlaw nearest the weapon was shouting at the ridge, not looking her way. She stretched her hand, brushing the grip of the pistol. The weight of it felt foreign, too heavy for her small hands, but it was real. It was something. She dragged it back into the shadows, her chest heaving. Her fingers fumbled on the cold metal. She had never fired one before. She did not even know if she could. But she could hold it. And maybe that would be enough. She looked up just as the warrior staggered back under the force of a blow. One outlaw raised his rifle stock to strike again, and her breath caught. Her finger hovered over the trigger, her hands trembling so hard the pistol shook. If she fired, every man in the canyon would hear. If she missed, she would reveal herself for nothing. If she did nothing, he would fall. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might break her ribs. The world narrowed to the sight before Hertha warrior, the outlaw. The weapon in her hands. The sound of horses crashed into the scene, another group spilling from the ridge. Dust rose, men shouted louder, and the outlaw's rifle swung higher. The warrior braced for the strike, his jaw set, his eyes hard. She gripped the pistol, her finger tightening, her breath held in her chest. Everything in the canyon bent toward that single moment, the clash that would decide more than just one fight. The cliffs echoed with gunfire. The river below rushed louder, as if urging the story forward. The wagon train moved blindly west, unaware of how close death had come. And she crouched in the shadow of the rock, holding her breath, clutching a weapon she had never meant to touch, knowing the choice she made in the next heartbeat could change everything. The canyon rang with the crack of gunfire, the shouts of men, the thunder of hooves tearing up the sand. She crouched low in the shadows, the pistol heavy in her shaking hands, her breath caught in her chest. The outlaw raised his rifle stock high, aiming to crush the warrior beneath its weight. Time seemed to stall, every heartbeat stretched thin, every sound sharpened until it was unbearable. Then she made her choice. Her finger pressed the trigger, and the shot split the morning air like lightning. The recoil slammed through her arms, nearly knocking the pistol from her grip. Smoke curled up, stinging her eyes. For a breathless second, she thought she had missed. Then the outlaw staggered, clutching his shoulder, the rifle slipping from his grasp. He fell hard into the dust. The warrior's head snapped toward her hiding place, his eyes flashing with surprise. She held the pistol close, trembling, unable to speak. But she had done it. She had stepped out of fear, if only for a single desperate act. The fight surged around them. The Ridge Riders swept down with wild cries, scattering the outlaws in every direction. Horses kicked, sand flew, rifles cracked again and again. The outlaws, thrown off balance by her shot and the riders' charge, broke into a ragged retreat. Two bolted for the river, splashing into the current with curses on their lips. Another scrambled for a loose horse and rode hard toward the canyon mouth. The man she had shot crawled into the brush, his face twisted with rage and pain, before vanishing into the rocks. Only silence followed, broken by the ringing of echoes and the fading sound of hooves. She lowered the pistol, her hands still shaking. The warrior stood in the clearing, chest heaving, sweat and dust streaking his skin. For a long moment, he said nothing, only looked at her as though seeing her in a new way. Not as the frightened girl shivering in the river, but as someone who had chosen to act, even when her fear nearly broke her. At last, he gave a small nod. No words, just the kind of acknowledgement that meant more than speech. She clutched the coat tighter, the weight of the moment pressing heavy on her. The Ridge Riders lingered only briefly. They circled the camp, checking for survivors, then spoke in low voices she could not understand. Their leader, a man with sharp eyes and a scarred chin, glanced toward her with suspicion, then turned back to the warrior. Few words were exchanged, but the meaning was clear enough. These riders had not come for her. They had come for their own reasons, territory rivalry, a chance to strike at the outlaws before they grew bolder. Once they were satisfied, they mounted their horses and rode off, leaving the canyon strangely quiet. When the dust settled, only she and the warrior remained. The fire had burned low, the ground scattered with broken weapons, footprints, and blood. She sat back against the stone, her chest still trembling, the pistol lying heavy in her lap. He approached her slowly, his steps sure, but heavy with exhaustion. She looked up at him, her throat dry, and whispered, "I thought they'd kill you." "They tried," he answered simply. His gaze fell to the pistol in her hands. She followed his eyes, then placed it down carefully on the stone between them. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, voice cracking. I had to." He studied her for a long moment, then picked up the weapon. He held it, turning it in his hand, then set it aside. "You chose," he said. "Not easy, but you chose." His voice carried neither judgment nor praise, only truth. The sun climbed higher, warming the canyon. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the silence soak into her bones. Her body ached with exhaustion, yet her mind churned with questions. What would happen now? The outlaws might return. The wagon train was still moving west, blind to the danger it had escaped. She was caught between two worlds, the settlers who would never understand why she had trusted an Apache warrior, and the wild, untamed land that seemed to claim him as its own. He broke her thoughts with a simple question. "Wagon trail. You return?" She hesitated. She thought of the wagons creaking through the dust, the faces of women who would whisper if they saw her in the coat of a man they called an enemy. She thought of the men guarding the iron box, blind to how close they had come to losing it. And she thought of him, standing steady, a man who had saved her when he had no reason to. "I don't know," she admitted softly. He looked toward the horizon, his profile hard against the rising sun. "They go west," he said. "Hard land, harder men, more outlaws, more soldiers." His voice carried a quiet certainty as if he had seen it all before. Then his eyes turned back to her. "But you are strong now." The words struck her deeply. She shook her head, not trusting them, but his gaze did not waver. She remembered the river, the fear that had nearly broken her, and the moment she had lifted the pistol. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps she had found something in herself she never knew was there. They walked together back toward the river, tracing the path through dust and stone. The silence between them felt different now. Not heavy, but steady. She thought of asking his name, of telling him hers, but some instinct told her it was not necessary. They had shared something deeper than names, something that would not fade with words. When they reached the bend in the canyon, she saw the trail in the distance. The wagons moved slowly, already climbing the far ridge. Her chest tightened. If she ran, she could catch them by evening. She could slip back into the fold, wrap herself in the rules she had known since childhood. Yet the thought left her unsettled. She had seen too much, changed too much. The settlers would never believe the truth of what had happened in the canyon, and perhaps she no longer cared if they did. The warrior stopped at the river's edge. He handed her a small piece of leather cord, worn and knotted, something that looked as though it had been with him for years. She held it in her palm, confused, but he only said, "For strength?" Then he turned toward the cliffs. Climbing back into the wild as though he belonged to it entirely, she stood watching until he vanished among the rocks. The canyon seemed larger without him, emptier, though his presence lingered in every shadow and stone. She pressed the leather cord to her heart, then tucked it into the coat. A tear slid down her cheek, not of fear, but of something she could not quite name. Gratitude, loss, hope. By dusk, she reached the wagon train. Dust rose around the wheels, oxen groaned, and tired voices murmured through the camp. No one asked where she had been. No one wanted to know. She slipped into her place as if nothing had happened, though everything inside her had changed. She sat by the fire that night, the coat wrapped tight, the cord hidden beneath it, and listened to the men argue over maps and miles. Their words felt small now, compared to the vast silence of the canyon. She did not tell them about the outlaws. She did not speak of the Ridge Riders or the battle in the dawn light. And she did not mention the warrior who had given her strength when she had none of her own. Some truths belonged to the land, not to the campfire. As the stars spread across the sky, she lifted her eyes to them. The west stretched ahead, filled with danger and promise, loss and love. She did not know where her path would lead, but she knew this. She was no longer the girl who had trembled in the river. She had asked for help, and it had been given. She had chosen to fight when she could have hidden. And she had seen courage not just in herself, but in the man who had walked beside her when the world turned. Dark the trail west would test her again. She could feel it in her bones. But whatever came, she would carry the memory of the canyon. The strength she had found, and the gift of knowing that even in the wildest, harshest lands, compassion could rise like water in a desert. And somewhere, far beyond the ridge, she imagined the warrior walking under the same stars. Bound to the wilderness, yet forever a part of her story. The wind shifted through the camp, carrying the faint scent of smoke and leather. And for a heartbeat she thought she could almost hear his voice. Then it was gone, leaving only the quiet night. The fire's glow, and the long road still waiting before her. She closed her eyes and held the leather cord tight. Whatever lay ahead, she was ready.